Kadosh Baruch Hu. Seidchem l'shalom, malachei hashalom, malachei elyon. Mi melech malachei hamlachim, hakadosh baruch hu. So apparently I'm supposed to say that the candles were lit earlier, but we have not yet blessed them. So would someone like to volunteer to either from their seat or maybe even go up there and offer the blessing over the candle lighting? Amen. Yasher Koah. And we will continue chanting the Psalms of Kabbalat Shabbat on page 15. Lechu neranena ladonai, naria letzur yishenu, nikadma fanav betoda, bizmirot naria lo. Arba'im shana akut bedor, va'omar am toe levavhem, vehem lo yadu derachai, asher nishpati ve'api, im yevo'un el menuchati. Shiru ladonai shir chadash, shiru ladonai kol haaretz, shiru ladonai baruch shemo, basru miyom leyom yeshuato, sapru vagoyim kivodo, bechol ha'amim niflotav, ki gadol Adonai. Hulal meod, no rahu, al kol Elohim, ki kol Elohe ha'amim elilim va'adonai shamayim asa, hod vehadar lefanav oz v'tiferet b'mikdasho, havu ladonai, mishbechot amim havu ladonai, kavod va'oz havu ladonai, kavod shemo, se'u mincha, uvo lechatzrotav, ishtachavu ladonai behadrat kodesh, chilu mipanav kol haaretz, imru vagoyim Adonai melech, aftikon tevel bal timod, Yadin amim b'mesharim, yismechu hashamayim v'tagel haaretz, yiram hayam umelo yalo sadai v'chol asher bo, az yiranenu kol atzeyar lifnei Adonai kiva lishbot haaretz, Yishbo tevel b'tzedek ve'amim be'munato, yai lai 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 lai, yai lai 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 lai, lai 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 lai, lai 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 lai, lai 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 lai, lai 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 lai. Page 17. Adonai malach, tagel haaretz, yismechu im rabim, anan va'arfel sevivav, tzedek umishpat mechon kiso. Or zaru ala tzadik, yishrei lev simcha, simchu tzadikim badonai, vehodu lezecher kodsho. Shiru ladonai pejetin shir chadash, iniflaot asa, Oshialo yemino, uzro akodsho. Lifnei Adonai kiva, lishpot haaretz, yishpot tevel betzedek, ve'amim b'meisharim. Adonai malach yirgezu amim, page 19, Yoshev kirovim tanu ta'aretz. Romemu Adonai Eloheinu, v'hishtachavu lahar kodsho, ki kadosh Adonai Eloheinu. We'll continue with the end of our Kabbalat Shabbat Psalms by singing the song of Kabbalat Shabbat, which is Lecha Dodi on page 21 and 22. I don't think there's any beginners here, so I don't need to tell you that we will rise on the final stanza. Lecha dodi likrat kala pene Shabbat ne'kabela. Lecha dodi likrat kala pene Shabbat ne'kabela. Shamor v'zachor bedibor echad hishmiyanu el hamyuchad Adonai echad u'shemo echad l'shem ultiferet ve'elitila lecha dodi likrat kala pene Shabbat ne'kabela. Likrat Shabbat lechu v'ne'elcha ki hi mekor haberacha meirosh mikedem nesucha sof maaseh b'machshavat tchila lecha dodi likrat kala pene Shabbat ne'kabela. Mikdash melech Ir melucha kumitzei mitocha hafecha arav lach shevet b'mekabacha vehu yachamo alayichem la lecha dodi likrat kala pene Shabbat ne'kabela. Hitna ari me'afar kumiliv shi bigday tifartecha mi al yad ben yishai beit alach michor va'el nafshi ge'ala lecha dodi likrat kala pene Shabbat ne'kabela. Hitoreri kiva orech Kumiori uri shir daberi kevod Adonai alaich nigla lecha dodi likrat kala pene Shabbat ne'kabela. Lo tevoshi velo tikami matish tochachi umatehemi bach yechesu aniye ami venibneta ir al tila lecha dodi likrat kala pene Shabbat ne'kabela. V'hayulim shisa shoasayich v'racha kukol mevalayich yasisalayich Elohayich kimsos chatan al kala lecha dodi krat kala pene Shabbat ne'kabela. Yamin usmol tifrotzi v'et Adonai taritzi al yadish ben partzi v'nismecha v'nagila lecha dodi likrat kala pene Shabbat ne'kabela boi v'shalom ater bala gam b'simcha Uvitzola atochemune am segula boi kala lecha dodi likrat kala pene Shabbat ne'kabela lecha dodi likrat kala pene Shabbat ne'kabela. Please be seated. And I think 1, 2, 3. We're not supposed to count people, but I'm pretty sure we have now 10 adults, plus whoever is on the TV screen. So we will be good moving forward. But before we get to the parts of the service that require a minyan, for example, Kiddush and Baruch Hu, we continue with the Psalm for the Sabbath day on page 23. Mizmor shir leyom hashabat tov lehodot la'adonai ulezamer leshimcha elyon ulezamer leshimcha elyon lehagid baboker chastecha ve'emunatcha balelot Ale asor vale navel ale higayon bechinor mizmor shir leyom hashabat tov lehodot la Adonai ulezamer leshimcha elyon ulezamer leshimcha elyon ki simachtani Adonai befo alecha b'maaseh yadecha aranen Magadlu masecha Adonai me'odam hu machshivotecha mizmor shir leyom hashabat tov lehodot la Adonai ulezamer leshimcha elyon ulezamer leshimcha elyon. Continue 4 lines from the bottom on page 23. Tzadikata mar yifrach ke'erez balvanon yiske shetuli beveit Adonai Bechatzrot Eloheinu yafrichu od yenuvun beseva deshenim verananim yiyu lehagit ki yashar Adonai Tsuri, tsuri, velo avlatabo. Seeing that we are 10, we continue on the bottom of page 24 with the conclusion of Kabbalat Shabbat with the Kaddish Yatom. Kadal via Kadash Shemei Rabba, Be'almadi Vrachirte, V'yamlich Malchute, B'chayechonu v'mechonu, B'chayeh Dechol Beit Yisrael, B'galau v'zman Kari, V'imru Amen, Yehei Shmei Rabba Mevorach, Le'olam Olal Me'al Maya, Yitbarach, Yitbarach V'yishtabach, V'yitpa'ar V'yitramam V'yitnaseh, V'yitadar V'yitalev V'yitalal Shemei Dekudash Abrichu, Leila min kol birchata v'shirata tushbchata v'nechemata damiran belma v'imeru amen yehei shlama rav mit shemayim chayim aleinu v'al kol Yisrael v'imeru amen osei shalom b'mramav hu yasei shalom aleinu v'al kol Yisrael v'imeru amen. We'll do that the next time we do it. There's a lot of Kaddishes. Not as many as there are tomorrow morning, but there's a lot of Kaddishes. That is the conclusion of Kabbalat Shabbat. I've been here enough times on Erev Shabbat to know that in between Kabbalat Shabbat and the Mariv service, this is when the rabbi typically offers a Devar Torah or sermon. I do not do Divrei Torah or sermon on Friday night. I prefer the more traditional approach, which you can actually see if you look on the next pages after the Kaddish that we just read. It says sources for study and reflection. The more traditional approach to a Friday evening service in the old world is that you would not hear a sermon, but you would study the laws of Shabbat, usually Mishnah Shabbat chapter 2, but other laws of Shabbat. The problem I have is that I led Friday night services several times last year, and I think I ended up studying with you all of the passages that are here in Sim Shalom. So I decided to bring a passage from Mishnah Shabbat that isn't in the book, but I'm going to read it to you. And together, we're going to try to figure out what profound message this, which is possibly the most famous of all the Mishnahs in the Mishnah, what profound message it is actually saying about Shabbat. Before we get there, I'm going to ask a few questions because it's small enough. I can actually treat this as though it were a class. So, according to the Torah, by which I mean Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, the book we're in now, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, what things can you not do on Shabbat? It says that we have to rest and we can't work. It says that over and over and over again. Well, but what does that mean? Well, in a few places in the Torah, it actually gives some examples of what that means. So does anyone know of any? Claire. Gathering wood. One of them is gathering wood. And the reason you know that is because earlier this week, you were studying the portion of the week, which is Shalach Lecha, in which there is at the very end, you'll read it tomorrow morning, although probably not because we don't do the full portion. But if you were reading the full portion tomorrow, you would hear the story of a couple of Jews who were going out on Saturday, and they come across a guy who's gathering wood. And they say, are you allowed to do that on the Sabbath? We're not sure. So they bring him to Moses. Moses says, let me go ask God. God says, no, you're not allowed to do that. Stone them. And then it moves on to a story about wearing tzitzis. Okay. That's one thing, you can't gather wood. What else are we told you cannot do? Kindle fire. So that is actually not in this portion. For that, you have to go back to the book of Exodus in chapter 35, where it says you cannot kindle fire. So gather wood, kindle fire. I'm going to give you a hint. There's only two more things. I thought you were saying talking on the telephone. Oh, electronics is something that's going to come much later because, of course, in the Torah, they had no conception of electricity as we now have it. But they did know about fire and they did know about gathering wood. Writing is going to come along a little bit later, as you're going to see. In Exodus chapter 34, we get two forbidden labors in one verse. You cannot reap and you cannot sow. Then there is a fifth kind of prohibited activity that comes the day that manna starts falling from heaven, and God says, well, on Friday you have to collect 2 portions of manna, which is why we have 2 chalot on the Shabbat table. You have to get 2 portions of manna because you can't go out on Saturday, because on Saturday you have to stay put, whatever that means. So if we only had the Torah, the written Torah, the 5 books of Moses, all we would know is that to rest on Shabbat means you don't reap or plow. No problem. I'm an urban Jew. You don't gather wood. No problem. I don't hike. And you don't kindle a fire. Well, that one could be tough. And then the last one, stay put. And yet you know that Shabbat observance through the years has included all kinds of different forbidden labors, including electricity, including writing, including using a hammer, and countless other things. So why? Well, that's because when the rabbis came along centuries later, they said, we need to better understand what it means to rest. And so what we are going to do in our first great work of law, which is called the Mishnah, in the 7th chapter, in the 2nd verse, we are going to lay out, enumerate a series of labors that we say are forbidden. They constitute work. Now, of course, it's going to include reaping, plowing, gathering wood, and lighting fire, because those are in the Torah, for crying out loud. But guess what? They come up with 39 forms of labor, not just 4. So what I want to do now is read them all for you very quickly so that your mind goes. Then we're going to go through them slowly, not one by one 39 times, but we're going to go through them in a slow way where you're going to say, oh, I see what they're doing. And what they're doing is actually pretty profound in what it says about the way they think Shabbat should be understood by Jews. So here's the list. The Mishnah says the primary labors, malacha, the primary labors on Shabbat that you can't do are 40 minus 1. That's 39. Matt's my math friend. Sowing, plowing, reaping, binding sheaves, threshing, winnowing, selecting, grinding, sifting, kneading, baking, shearing wool, bleaching, hackling, dyeing, spinning, stretching, making 2 meshes, weaving 2 threads, dividing 2 threads, knotting, unknotting, sewing 2 stitches, tearing in order to sew 2 stitches, capturing a deer, slaughtering, flaying, salting, curing, scraping, cutting, writing 2 letters, erasing in order to write 2 letters, building, pulling down, extinguishing, kindling, hammering, and carrying. That's 39 if you were counting. Now you might say, why those 39? Now, one way that the rabbis tried to explain why those 39 is they said these were the 39 labors that were required in order to build the tabernacle, the temple that followed them around in the wilderness. Well, didn't follow them around, they brought it with them. That's in a collection of Jewish literature called Midrash. But the Mishnah doesn't give any explanation. It just says these are the 39 labors. Why? Well, now we're going to take them in a group, 4 different groups of labor. And I promise you that if we take them a little slower and we separate them into 4 groups, you'll see exactly what each set of labors is designed to describe. So let's look at the first ones I discussed. Imagine you cannot sow, plow, reap, bind sheaves, thresh, winnow, select, grind, rift, knead, or bake. Those are all of the labors that go from scratch into what? Making a loaf of bread. Then it continues. Shearing wool, bleaching, hackling. I don't know what hackling is, but dyeing, spinning, stretching, making 2 meshes. That's like the warp and the woof. I don't know. Weaving 2 threads, dividing 2 threads, knotting, unknotting, sewing, and tearing in order to sew. All of the activities from scratch that you would have to engage in order to make a shirt. Capturing a deer, slaughtering, flaying, salting, curing, scraping, cutting, writing 2 letters, and erasing in order to write 2 letters. All the steps you would have to do if you wanted from scratch to write a book, a Torah, write on deer hide in a scroll. And lastly, building, pulling down, extinguishing, kindling, hammering, and carrying. This is maybe a little bit more abstract, but you have to do all of those things if you want to build what? I gave it away. What? A house, yes, building shelter. You would have to build, pull down, extinguish things. You'd have to kindle fire in order to hone your instruments. You'd have to hammer. You'd have to carry bricks from place to place, and so on and so forth. So in a sense, what this Mishnah is saying is not you can't do these 39 labors. It's saying you cannot do anything that is involved in the process for constructing food, clothing, shelter, and books. Why? Well, I presume the reason is because the rabbis understand the Sabbath as an opportunity to escape human existence and to return to a primeval form of human existence in which we did not have to use our creative labors on a daily basis to provide for the essential needs of humankind. We speak all the time about how the essential needs of humankind are food, clothing, and shelter. Right? Any civilized community says that food, clothing, and shelter are the bare necessities that should be provided to any person. And food, clothing, and shelter don't come naturally. You have to make food if you're a person, make clothes, make shelter. Well, in the Garden of Eden, they didn't have to. The food was just there for them to eat. The clothing was just not existent until they messed up, right? They didn't need shelter. It was warm and beautiful all the time. And there were no children. So there was no need to preserve knowledge to pass on to another generation. So there was no need for books. So what the rabbis seem to be suggesting is that Shabbat is an opportunity to undo civilization, to return back to a time when human existence was in its unfallen state. Now, presumably, the rabbis also assume that when the end of time comes, whenever that is, human beings that merit it are going to participate in something called Olam Haba, the next world. Well, they often ask the question, what is Olam Haba like? And the most standard answer is Verweis. They say there's Yemot HaMoshiach, the days of the Messiah. That's the end of history. And they say, we know what's going to happen then. There's going to be earthquakes and wars and sickness, and it's going to be horrible. And then a king is going to come and save Jews and get rid of mean Gentiles, and everything's going to be okay. And then they say, what comes next is Olam Haba. What's that like? The human mind cannot conceive it, but they do say that Shabbat is a Vorspeise. It's an appetizer. It's 1/60th of that experience. Presumably because if you can remove from your life all of the labors that you engage in order to make food, clothing, shelter, and knowledge, you return to that idyllic state of Eden, which is 1/60th of what life will be like in Olam Haba. So I think that's what the rabbis are driving at. But I want to say one more thing before we finish, because I find it neat, and a number of people that I've taught this text to find it interesting, that it's not just food, clothing, and shelter. Those are the bare necessities of life. You don't really need books. Now, I know intellectuals and people who want to sound smart, they say, I need my books as much as I need my morning coffee. Well, you don't really need them. And yet the rabbis seem to be suggesting that no. In fact, the necessities of life are not just the physical necessities that keep you warm and full, but also the intellectual development that comes through education and that comes through books. And I don't think there's any surprise at all that the labors involved in producing a book are considered to be the essential labors of humankind here in this Mishnah. And it's presumably why elsewhere throughout rabbinic literature, the value of teaching and learning are paramount. Indeed, you probably know the expression that Talmud Torah keneged kulam, that if you put all the mitzvot of Judaism on one side and Talmud Torah on the other, the scale would balance, because Talmud Torah is equal to all of the other commandments combined. So it's been my pleasure to engage with teaching and learning with you all this evening. I'm coming back in 2 weeks. I have to find another law of Shabbat to talk about, because I've done Mishnah Shabbat 7.2, and we have done all the ones in the text here, but I'll come up with something. Let's continue with Ma'ariv, which is located on page, I closed my book, which was not a smart idea. Page 28, and we begin Ma'ariv with Baruch Hu. Please rise. Baruch Hu et Adonai HaMevorach. Baruch Adonai Barach Leolam Va'ed. Please be seated. Umavir yom umevi laila, umavdil ben yom uvein laila, Adonai tzabaot shemo. El chai v'chayam, tamid yimloch aleinu leolam va'ed. Baruch ata Adonai, ha'ma'ariv araviv. Ahavat olam Beit Yisrael amchavta. Torah u'mitzvot chukim u'mishpatim otanu limadeta. Al ken Adonai Eloheinu b'shochveinu v'kumeinu nasiach b'chukecha. V'nismach b'divrei Toratecha u'v'mitzvotecha le'olam va'ed. Ki hem chayenu ve'orech yameinu u'vahem nege yomam v'layla. Ve'ahavatcha al tasir mimenu le'olamim. Baruch ata Adonai, ohev amo Yisrael. Page 30. Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. V'ahavta et Adonai Elohecha b'chol levavcha u'v'chol nafshecha u'v'chol me'odecha. V'hayu hadvarim ha'ele asher anochi metzavecha hayom al levavecha v'shinantam levanecha v'dibarta abam b'shivtecha b'veitecha uv'lechtecha v'aderech uv'shochbecha uv'kumecha u'kshartam le'ot al yadecha v'hayu letotafot be'in einecha uchtavtam al mezuzot beitecha uvi she'arecha. I don't mean to interrupt anyone's prayer. Does anyone know why we don't do this paragraph of the Shema? I know that in Reform settings, this paragraph was almost always taken out of Sidurim because it deals with reward and punishment. The idea that if we're good, God will make it rain, and if we're naughty, God won't. And the Reformers didn't like that, so they just expunged it. Here, it's in the text, and yet we sing the first paragraph in the last paragraph, which is about wearing tzitzit. This one we mumble over. And I don't know how that tradition developed in the conservative movement. Now that I've interrupted your prayer, I don't know. I know a lot about the development of Reform liturgy, but I was not trained in a conservative seminary. So much of the conservative liturgy I have been learning as I'm going along. In any case, let's continue as we typically do on the top of page 31. Vayomer Adonai el Moshe lemor daber el bnei Yisrael v'amarta alehem v'asu lahem tzitzit al kanfei vigdeihem ledorotam v'natnu al tzitzit hakanaf petil techelet. V'haya lachem letzitzit b'ritam oto uzchartem et kol mitzvot Adonai v'asitem otam v'lo taturu acharei levavchem v'acharei nechem asher atem zonim achareihem lema'an tizkeru v'asitem et kol mitzvotai Vitem kadoshim leloechem, ani Adonai Elohechem, asher hotzeiti edchem me'eretz Mitzrayim, liot lachem lelohim, Ani Adonai Elohechem. We continue on page 32 with the prayer celebrating the redemption at the Red Sea, Mi Chamocha, about halfway down on the page. Mi Chamocha Ba'elim Adonai, Mi Chamocha Nedar B'Kodesh, Nora Tehilot, Oh, Sefele, Malchutecha Ra'uvanecha, Boker Yam Lifnei Moshe, Ze'eli Anu V'Amru, Adonai Imloch Le'olam Va'ed, V'ne'emar Kifad Adonai Yaakov, Uge'alo Miyad Chazak Mimenu, Baruch Ata Adonai Gal Yisrael. Let's throw in a prayer in English, and Hashkivenu is as good as any. On the top of page 33 in English, I will read. You are welcome to join me if you so choose. Help us, Adonai, to lie down in peace and awaken us again, our sovereign, to life. Spread over us your shelter of peace. Guide us with your good counsel. Save us because of your mercy. Shield us from enemies and pestilence, from starvation, sword, and sorrow. Remove the evil forces that surround us. Shelter us in the shadow of your wings, O God, who watches over us and delivers us, our gracious and merciful ruler. Guard our coming and our going. Grant us life and peace, now and always. Spread over us the shelter of your peace. Praised are you, Adonai, who spreads the shelter of peace over us, over all his people Israel, and over Jerusalem. Ufros aleinu sukat shlomecha, baruch ata Adonai, haporei sukat shalom aleinu, bal kol amo Yisrael, val Yerushalayim. Vishamru on page 34. Vishameru v'nei Yisrael, et ha-Shabbat, la'asod et ha-Shabbat, lidorotam berit olam. Beini uvein b'nei Yisrael oti le'olam. Ki sheshet yamim asa Adonai et hashamayim ve'et haaretz uvayom hashevi'i shavat vayinafash. We'll continue after Chatzi Kaddish, and we rise for Chatzi Kaddish on the bottom of page 34. With the Amidah on page 35A and 35B, and it continues for a couple of pages. We will do that silently, and then I thought we would, when we come back, do something we don't normally do here, which is the abbreviated Shabbat recitation of the Amidah. You may know that normally the Amidah is recited by yourself, 18 blessings, and then takes a long time because the Shatz comes up and recites all 18 blessings again. But on Friday evening, the sages decreed that the recitation is much briefer because people need to get home and eat, or get home and eat dessert, or go to a Little League game, or whatever it is they need to do. So we will do that traditional blessing, which you have probably heard before, when we come back after reciting the Amidah silently. So first on the bottom of page 34, Chatzi Kaddish, and then the Amidah. Yitkada v'yitkadash shemei Rabba, v'yalma divrach yirutei v'yamlich malchutei b'chayechonu v'yomechonu v'chayei dechol beit Yisrael, ba'agala ba'agala u'v'yisma'an ka'ariv, v'imeru amen. Yehei shmei Rabba mevorach, le'alam ulal me'al maya yitbarach. Yitbarach, v'yishtabach, v'yitbar, v'yitramam, v'yitnaseh, v'yitadar, v'yitalev, v'yitalal, shemei dekudesha b'richu, Le'ela min kol birchata v'shirata, tushbechata v'nechemata da'amir an be'alma v'imeru. Amen. Okay, so why don't we continue with the recitation on page 47, for which we rise if we are able. And when we get to the abbreviated Avot Gevurot, you will see how a bunch of prayers have been smashed together. Vayechulu hashamayim v'haaretz v'chol tzivam v'echalohim b'yom hashvi'i melachto asher asa v'yishbot b'yom hashvi'i mikol melachto asher asa v'yevarech Elohim et yom hashvi'i v'yekadesh oto ki vo shavat mikol melachto asher bara Elohim la'asot Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu v'Elokei avotenu V'imotenu, Elohei Avraham, Elohei Yitzchak, Elohei Yaakov, Elohei Sarah, Elohei Rivka, Elohei Rachel, Elohei Leah, El Hagadol Hagibor, V'hanora El Elyon, Konei Shamayim Va'aretz, Magem Navod Bidva'aro, Mechaye Metim B'ma'amaro, Ha'el Hakadosh She'ein Kamohu, Hameniach le'amo b'yom Shabbat kodsho. Kivam ratza lehaniach lahem. Kivam ratza lehaniach lahem. Lefanav navod b'yirav afachad. V'nodeh lishmo b'chol yom tamid. Me'on ha'brachot el ha'hodaot. Adon ha'shalom. Mekadesh hashabat umvarech shvi'i umeniach bikdusha la'amedu shnei oneg zecher 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 lema'aseh v'reshit Eloheinu v'Elohei avotenu ritzei v'imnuchatenu kadshenu b'mitzvotecha v'tein chelkenu b'toratecha Sabenu mituvecha v'samchenu b'shuatecha v'taher libenu liovdecha be'emet V'hanchilenu Adonai Eloheinu b'ahava uvratzon Shabbat kodechecha v'yanuchu v'Yisrael mikad she'eshemecha Baruch atah Adonai mikadesh ha-Shabbat Yikadav Yikadash Shemei Rabbah B'Almad Yivrach Yute V'Yamlich Malchute B'Chaychonu V'Mechonu V'Chayedechol Beit Yisrael B'Galav V'Zman Kariv V'imeru Amen Yeheshmei Rabba Mevorach Le'alam Ulal Me'al Maya Yitbarach Yitbarach V'Yishtabach V'Yitpa'ar V'Yitramam V'Yitnaseh V'Yithadar V'Yitaleh V'Yitalal Shemei Dekudesha B'Richu Le'el Amin Kol Birchata V'Shirata Tush B'Chata V'Nechemata Da'amiran B'Alma V'imeru Amen. Titkabal Tzlo Tonu Vauton Dechol Yisrael Kodem Avuchon Divi Shemaya V'imeru Yehi Shlomo Rav Mishmai v'Chayim Aleinu v'Al Kol Yisrael v'imeru Oseh Shalom b'Imromav Hu Ya'aseh Shalom Aleinu v'Al Kol Yisrael v'Al Kol Yoshvei Tevel v'imeru Amen. I suppose we can be seated for a moment before we get to Aleinu, because this is ordinarily the time when I guess the rabbi says, welcome to the Pasadena Jewish Temple and Center. I'm Rabbi Carrier. That's not going to happen again, if I'm not mistaken. For those who don't know me, I'm a lowly congregant who is helping out in these weeks of transition between Rabbi Carrier going out and Rabbi Goldstein, who I went to high school with, coming in. And the cantor is in Israel right now. So the next few weeks of Shabbat services, Friday and Saturday, are going to be some of the, I suppose we could say, more able congregants that can be shlichei tzibor for these services. I say that I don't think for anyone here, but maybe there are people in the ether that are wondering why I'm here. And I think I'm also supposed to do announcements in this section of the service, but I see a lot of no events scheduled, except for like juggling and stuff. So, oh, my name is Josh, Joshua Garraway, but you can just call me Josh. Yeah, and that's my boy over there. Yeah. So, does anyone have an announcement that they think is important to make right now? Otherwise, we can proceed towards the conclusion of the service. Okay. What's that? Oh, there they are. Yeah, there's juggling. I mean, that's important. And then next week, you can see Rabbi Josh Grader will be leading Shabbat. I'm going to be chanting next Shabbat. And so is Sarah. Are you? Oh, not until July. Okay, well, let us continue with the conclusion of the service, beginning with Aleinu L'Shabeach, which is on page 51. Please rise. Aleinu L'Shabeach La'adon HaKol La'teit Gedula Liotzer Breshit Shelo asanu kegoye ha'aratzot velo samanu kemishpechot ha'adama shelo sam chalkenu kahem v'goralenu kechol hamonam va'anachnu korim umishtachavim umodim lifnei melech malchei hamlachim hakadosh baruch hu. Oh, okay. The bottom of page 51. V'ne'emar v'haya Adonai lemelech al kol haaretz bayom hahu yiyeh Adonai echad ushemo echad. Please be seated. In love, we remember those who no longer walk this earth. We are grateful to God for the gift of their lives, for the joys we shared, and for the cherished memories that never fade. May God grant those who mourn the strength to see beyond their sorrow, sustaining them despite their grief. May the faith that binds us to our loved ones be a continuing source of comfort as we invite those who mourn and those observing yahrzeit to praise God's name with the words of the Kaddish. And this week, you can stand now, but there's a lengthy list here. This week, the community is commemorating the yahrzeits of Philip Applebaum, Morris Bass, Isaac Breslau, Morris Bresner, James Dinerman, Tommy Fremen, Mervyn Gold, Helen Gorfinkel, Hilda Grable, Adele Halper, Hugo Hanauer, Daniel Ivler, Frank Lash, Thelma Lassman, Harold Lindstone, Julius Lokeets, Ruth Meltzner, Alfreda Galantiere Mindlin, Mickey Newman, Edward Pechter, Mary Rombach, Betty Rossman, Harry Ruskin, Laura Sandig, Herbert Schiff, Paula Foreman Schiffman, Neil Siegel, Dina Shepard, Eva Silberman, Marcia Spira, Shirley Spitzer, Alan Tornek, Geneva Wadsworth, and Mary Wolbeck. If there were any names that I mispronounced, or if you are in either Shiva Shloshim or the first year of mourning and would like to announce a name, please do so now. We will join together then on page 52 for Kaddish Yatom. Yitgadal v'yitkadash shemei Rabbah, be'alma divra chirute v'yamlich malchute, b'chayechon uvyomechon uvchaye dechol beit Yisrael, ba'agala uvizman kariv v'imru amen. Yehe shmei Rabbah mevarach le'olam ulalmei almaya. Yitbarach v'yishtabach v'yitpa'ar v'yitromam v'yitnaseh. V'yit hadar, v'yit alev, v'yit halal, shemei dekudesha b'richu. Le'ela min kol birchata v'shirata, tushbechata v'nechemata, da amiran ba'alma v'imru amen. Yehe shlama rabba min shemaya, v'chayim aleinu v'al kol Yisrael, v'imru amen. Oseh shalom bimromav, Hu ya'aseh shalom aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael ve'imru. Amen. May their memories be for a blessing. And we will conclude with a song that used to conclude every Friday night service, but now we almost never do it, but it's a personal favorite of mine, and that is on page 53 with Yigdal. Page 53. Yigdal Elohim chai ve'yishtabach nimtza ve'ein et el mitziuto echad ve'ein yachid ke'yichudo ne'lam v'gam ein sof le'achduto ein lo demuta guf ve'ein o guf lo na'aroch elav kedushato Kadmon l'chol davar asher nivra rishon ve'ein reshit le'reshito hino adon olam v'chol notzar yoreg gedulato malchuto shefa nevuato netano el anshe segulato v'tifarto lo kam b'Yisrael k'Moshe od navi umabid et temunato Torah temet natan le'amoel al yad nevio neman beito lo yachalif ha'el velo yamir dato le'olamim lezulato Sofeh v'yodea sitarenu mabit l'sof davar bekadmato gomer le'ish chesed kemifa'alo noten l'rasha ra kerishato Yishlach leketz yamin meshichenu lifdot mechakeketz Yeshuato metim yechayel berov chasto Baruch adei ad shem tehilato metim yechayel berov chasto Baruch adei ad shem tehilato. Shabbat shalom. I think we now go to the back and enjoy oneg and blessings. "56 minutes.
It was under an hour.
Okay.
I enjoyed every second of it.
I didn't. Okay, so
Yeah, I think you're good to go.
okay, so does someone, why doesn't everybody get some? I think we only have juice. Do I need to tell you when we're starting, or it will just unmute? Oh, okay. All right, why doesn't everybody get some
It's another
fruit of the vine? This is so weird. Just to go into my comedy act. Vayechulu hashamayim va'aretz v'chol tzevam vayichal Elohim b'yom hashvi'i malachto asher asa vayishbot b'yom hashvi'i mikol malachto asher asa vayevarech Elohim et yom hashvi'i vayikadesh oto kivo shavat mikol malachto asher bara Elohim la'asot savri Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam borei pari hagafen. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kiddeshanu mitzvotav v'ratzavanu v'shabbat kodsho b'ahava uvratzon hinchilanu zikaron lema'aseh v'reshit ki hu yom techila lemikra kodesh zecher litziat mitzrayim Kivanu v'acharta v'yotanu kidashta mikol ha'amim v'shabbat kodshecha b'yahava uvratzon hinchaltanu Baruch atah Adonai mekadesh hashabbat. Is there anyone who does typically wash hands? No, I'm saying the rabbi. I'm saying, is there anyone who does typically do it and would like to do it on behalf of everyone? Because I don't typically do it. Not this way. Yeah, ideally, the Tzibur is doing prayers on behalf of others. take seriously themselves. In a world of choice Judaism, sometimes the shots doesn't necessarily do it on his or her. In any case, would someone like to lead Moki? Let's do it together. Bow. I know, I'm not sure what our hygienic procedures are here. Okay, we'll just cut it a little bit.